One. Myself, Dr. Pradyot, founder and director of Movement Maestro Academy. Welcome you all to our global platform, Movement Maestro Academy official YouTube channel. Today, we are going to discuss on introduction to biomechanics of wrist and hand complex. For this session, I'm glad to invite our renowned resource person, Dr. Amita Aggarwal, ma'am. Over to you, ma'am.
Greetings for the day. Before I begin my lecture on biomechanics of wrist and hand complex as a part of a free webinars included for the World Physiotherapy Day, I would like to thank the Movement Maestro Academy for giving me an opportunity to be a resource person for the same. Let's start with the webinar. So let me just, yes. So biomechanics of wrist and hand complex. In short, we will discuss this like an introduction topic. So we are aware that the wrist is defined to be a wrist complex. Why? Because it is made up of together two joints, radiocarpal joint and a midcarpal joint. The radiocarpal articulation, in the first diagram, we can see here that the proximal articular surface is formed with the help of radius, and along with the radius, there is a radioulnar disc, while the distal articular surface is formed by the scaphoid lunate and triquetrum. This forms the radiocarpal joint. But along with the radiocarpal joint, the wrist is a complex. It includes the proximal and the distal row of carpals articulation with each other, referred to as a midcarpal joint. So, in the first diagram, all the bones, that is radius, ulna, scaphoid, lunate, pisiform, triquetrum, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate has been shown along with the 5 metacarpals, while in the second diagram, the various supporting ligaments along with the radioulnar disc has been shown. So, as discussed, the radiocarpal joint has a proximal articulation formed by the radius and the radioulnar disc, and the distal articulation by the scaphoid, lunate, and the triquetrum. The structure, which is referred to as a radioulnar disc, it includes is a triangular fibrocartilaginous disc, which is a central portion of the thin TFC, and it is having a chondroid fibrocartilage. This chondroid fibrocartilage is a type of tissue which is often seen in the structures which have to bear a lot of compressive forces. And including this, it also has a radioulnar ligaments, which are the principal stabilizers for the distal radioulnar joint, but they do have a contribution towards the wrist joint. And the ulnocarpal ligaments, the one which unite your ulnar bone to the carpals, that is ulnolunate bone and the ulnotriquetral ligaments. So Palmer and colleagues, they have found that there is an inverse relationship between the thickness of the triangular fibrocartilaginous complex and the ulnar variance. So if the ulnar variance is positive, which means that the relatively length of the ulna is higher compared to the radius, it generally happens after the fracture of the distal end of the radius, such as after the Colles fracture. In such cases, there will be a relative thinning up of the TFCC, that is triangular fibrocartilaginous complex. And if it is comparatively thin, it has more chances to get more injured also. So typically this TFCC is injured when there is a combination of forces of rotation along with the compression. And as it has been designed to bear more of compressive loads, most common injuries are seen with the gymnastic people. Coming to the midcarpal joint, which also contributes towards the formation of the wrist complex, the proximal articulation is formed by the scaphoid, lunate, and triquetrum only, while the distal articulation will be formed by the trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. It could be thought to have two parts, a medial and the lateral one. The medial one has been highlighted here as a little grayer one, that is the lunate and triquetrum proximally articulating with the capitate and hamate distally, And the lateral portion is consisting of the scaphoid articulation with the trapezium and trapezoid, together forming a wrist complex. So to provide a stability in any of the joint along with the bones, there is a requirement of certain active and the passive structure. With respect to the joint, let's first discuss the ligaments. So for the ligaments, they are present on the dorsal surface as well as on the volar aspect. So on the dorsal surface, there are dorsal carpal ligament, simply categorized as extrinsic and intrinsic ligament. We are also aware about the extrinsic and the intrinsic hand muscle. So what are these terminologies used for? Extrinsic means something which has got its origin somewhere else and is getting inserted there into hand, while intrinsic means something which has its origin as well as insertion in the hand only. So in the extrinsic ligament, we have on the dorsal aspect the dorsal radiocarpal ligament, which originates at the radius and gets inserted at the carpal, while intrinsic ligament are certain dorsal intercarpal ligament, which originates as well as insert within the carpal only. Also, on the volar aspect, to provide a good stability, the extrinsic ligaments include the radial collateral ligament, ulnar collateral ligament, radioscapholunate ligament, radiolunate ligament, radioscaphocapitate ligament, triangular fibrocartilaginous complex, and the ulnolunate ligament. The very important intrinsic ligament related to which the wrist instability, dorsal intercalated segment instability, volar intercalated segmental instability, such conditions are present, includes the scapholunate ligament, which combines the scaphoid with the lunate, providing it a good stability, and a lunotriquetral, which will be uniting the lunate with the triquetral bone, maintaining the proximal intercalated segment stability. Now, in biomechanics, we generally read two terms, kinetics and kinematics. What does kinematic define? So when we are discussing about some movement without actually telling what are the forces which is causing that movement, it is defined as kinematics. So if I'll say in the wrist joint, I have four movements, that is flexion, extension, radial and ulnar deviation. So I have flexion and extension in one plane and I have radial ulnar deviation in the other plane. So I have in the two planes these four movements possible. So I'm not telling here what are the flexors which have caused the flexion. We are just discussing that 0 to 80 degree is the flexion range happening in the sagittal plane. Similarly, extension is 70 degree in the sagittal plane. The ulnar deviation is little bit more greater because of the inclination of the radius and a little larger length of the radius. So we have a radial deviation of 0 to 20 degree and an ulnar deviation of 0 to 30 degree, both in the coronal plane. On an average, 50 to 60% extension happens at the radiocarpal joint and 40 to 50% will happen at the midcarpal joint. Now, whatever our activities of daily living involve, they involve a little less range of motion than this. So as a physiotherapist, we try to achieve the functional activity range at least. And 90% wrist injuries in the athletics are compressive in nature, and generally they happen with the extended position of the wrist. And most of the activities of daily living, they require the wrist extension and the ulnar deviation movements. Now, if we discuss the extension movement, so from the neutral position, how the whole extension happens, or from the full flexion, how the full extension at the wrist joint goes. Before that, we should know that there is a proximal row of carpal, that is the scaphoid, trapezium, trapezoid. It is an intercalated segment. Now, when the compressive forces are applied across this segment, it tend to move in the opposite direction and tend to collapse. But because of the functional and anatomical connections to the lunate by the presence of intrinsic volar ligaments and the distal row of carpals, the stability is present and the collapse won't happen. So what happens while the wrist is in complete flexion, initially the distal row of the carpals will glide in the same direction as the hand is moving. That is, both will move towards the extension. As the wrist will reach the neutral position, there will be a stability maintained by the scaphocapitate ligament. Both move towards a close packed position. And now as the extension will continue, the distal row of carpal along with the scaphoid will continue to move on a relatively fixed lunate and triquetrum. As the 45-degree angle of extension is approached, the scapholunate interosseous ligament is into a close packed position. Now, all the carpals will unite together and will move as a single unit on the radius and the triangular fibrocartilaginous complex. So, at the wrist full extension, there will be a complete taut ligaments. Kinetics. Kinetics describe you the various forces which are causing those extension or flexion or radial or ulnar deviation at the wrist joint. So kinematics discuss about the movement happening, and kinetics discuss about the muscle forces which is causing that action. So on the volar aspect, we are having these 7 muscles, that is palmaris longus, flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris. These 2 are the major wrist flexors, as mentioned with the terminology of carpi, good to remember. And flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis longus, some of the multi-joint muscles. On the dorsal aspect, we have extensor pollicis brevis, abductor pollicis longus, extensor carpi radialis longus, brevis, extensor pollicis longus, extensor digitorum, extensor indicis, extensor digiti minimi, and extensor carpi ulnaris. Here we can see, except the wrist complex, we have the whole hand, and this hand is made up of several other joints, which includes the carpometacarpal joint formed between the carpals and the metacarpal. Then we have metacarpophalangeal joint, we have proximal and the distal interphalangeal joint. Here we have which bones? Metacarpal, proximal phalanx, middle phalanx, and the distal phalanx. But we have only PIP and the DIP joint and not any middle interphalangeal joint. So let's start with the discussion of carpometacarpal joint. So it is present between the distal row of carpal and the metacarpal. Here there is a presence of certain ligament, the most commonly being the one which is connecting the head of the metatarsal. So in this diagram, the proximal end being formed by metacarpals are stabilized at the distal end by the deep transverse metacarpal ligament. Along with this, there is a transverse carpal ligament, which is a distal portion of the flexor reticula, but it has its contribution towards stability at the carpometacarpal joint, and a transverse intercarpal ligament also. The first and the fourth carpometacarpal joint are having a 1 degree of freedom. That's why whenever any movement is done, we can see that at the first and at the fourth carpometacarpal joint, the movement is happening. But the 2 metacarpals, that is second and the third, they are relatively fixed and they have 0 degree of freedom. The fifth metacarpal along with the carpal, so fifth CMC joint, it has 2 degree of freedom. Next, coming to the metacarpophalangeal joint. This metacarpophalangeal joint is formed between the proximal head of the metacarpal, which is convex, and the distal is formed by the proximal phalanx, which is concave. So convexo-concavo rule. And here we are having the biaxial joint. So it is a bicondylar joint. It is a little incongruent joint. To increase the congruency, several structures are present, and this includes the stability structures also, which include your volar plates and the collateral ligaments. They provide a good stability as well as a congruency by increasing overall the surface area and maintaining the tendons into a good position. Now, there is a projection of fibrocartilaginous structures in the metacarpophalangeal joint, proximal interphalangeal joint, and distal interphalangeal joint. As they are maximum towards the metacarpophalangeal joint, the chances of osteoarthritis is maximum with the DIP joint. It is a very important part to remember that because of the maximum fibrocartilaginous extension at the metacarpophalangeal joint and PIP compared to the DIP joint, the chances of osteoarthritis are relatively more common in the distal interphalangeal joint. And as we have in the World Physiotherapy Day, the theme as osteoarthritis, one should be aware of this fact. Coming to the interphalangeal joint, so we have proximal and the distal interphalangeal joint. Now here we are having a capsule, we have a volar plate to maintain the stability, and the collateral ligaments to maintain the medial and the lateral aspect of stability. Here the range of flexion extension is much greater at the PIP joint than at the DIP joint. In this diagram, we can see that the sagittal band, how it is connecting the proximal, how it is connecting the volar to the ventral surface, and here the presence of the flexor digitorum profundus or superficialis tendon covered over by the pulleys. So there we'll just soon discuss the role of the pulleys, but here we can see that these tendons are encased within their own sheath, and then they are maintained in contact with this orange structure as volar plates with the help of this annular pulleys, which are trying to maintain it in more position and preventing any bowstringing action. It does decrease the momentum, but it do prevent the injuries and the more chances of the associated conditions like trigger finger. On the dorsal aspect, we can see the tendon of extensor digitorum running, and we have the metacarpophalangeal joint capsule. So this will be my last slide for the day, and it includes the annular pulleys and the cruciate pulleys. As discussed just now, these pulleys are actually annular pulleys are 5, and we have 3 cruciate pulleys in the fingers specifically. So here the 3 annular pulleys, the A1, it is being shown as here in the various regions. They help to maintain the stability of the various tendons which are passing through them and will prevent any of their bowstringing action, as most of these tendons are multi-joint. So that there are chances that the impingement can happen, and later on the nodule formation or the tendon sheath involvement can happen. But they help to maintain a very good stability. They are present in this direction, while there are 3 cruciate pulleys also which are present in the oblique directions, and they are cruciform in nature. Being a basic introductory lecture, it includes more of the joints which are present in the hand, why the DIP joint is more commonly involved with the osteoarthritis, and what are the various stability imbibed structures like ligaments and the pulleys which are present here, and the volar plates we have a little bit discussion, TFCC complex. These structures are very important with aspect to the biomechanics of wrist and hand complex. Hope you all would give it a best shot and you will learn about the basic biomechanics. Thank you, everyone.